Joined by our pal Eben Novy-Williams from Sportico, a man who just loves to break news about DC sports ownership. Obviously, we will talk about Josh Harris, who, if you don't remember, the man who broke the story that Josh Harris was buying to the Commanders was Eben Novy-Williams. And so we'll get to Josh here first, but Eben, you also broke some news today that the second biggest stakeholder in Monumental Sports is selling her 10% of that company. So that is obviously a big story considering everything that has been happening with Monumental recently. So we'll get to that breaking news from today in just a little bit. But I'm curious, man, as someone who's followed Josh Harris through multiple team purchases and kind of watched the empire that he's built sports-wise, to see him land Adam Peters today, the number one GM job on the market, and having such the understanding of like the sports business ecosystem, to watch the Washington Commanders get the guy that everyone else wanted. Like, what's your reaction from the very unique vantage point that you have?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Craig. I think what Josh is doing is fascinating. One of the things I've been consistently thinking about as I watch what this new ownership group is doing is that this is one of the benefits in the NFL of having a really rich owner, right? It's a hard salary cap. It's not like baseball. Steve Cohen bought the Mets and pumped hundreds of millions of dollars into payroll. He fundamentally changed. It didn't work out on the field, but he fundamentally changed the Mets roster overnight. It's really hard for an NFL owner to come in and fundamentally change what the team is doing on the field. He can't spend dramatically more than anybody else. One thing that owners can do, though, is a lot of other things. He can spend on personnel. He can spend on a stadium, which I'm sure he will do at some point relatively soon. This is the benefit of having a new owner, an ownership group that is collectively worth $50+ billion. And it makes me think of the Walton family in Denver. One of the things that they did year one, the last game of the season, when their players were upset about the turf, they put in a new sod field for this week 17, literally the last game of the season. It's little things like that. It's hiring the most desired GM candidate. It's being able to get Bob Myers to consult on what you're doing. It's all those little things that really change over time, change the course of a franchise that a well-connected, many times over billionaire can do. So that's the thing that's on my mind when I think about this.
For the Myers hire specifically, to bring in someone from outside football. Football is such, as you know, like especially in the higher levels of it, it's so insular. Like like bringing in someone from the outside is like, whoa, like outside? Well, there's an outside. So when you see the Myers move, is there anything else that you've seen in sports quite like it? And what do you think of it?
There is. I think that in the past few years, college sports, the progressive people in college sports are learning this lesson also. That is another industry, college football, just like professional football, as you said, Craig, that is extremely insular. And it's a copycat system, and everybody wants the person that has been in the industry for a while. And then the Big 12 came along and hired Brett Yormark to be its commissioner. And he's been a revelation for the Big 12. I think he has steered the Big 12 kind of through the disastrous fallout that some of these mid-tier conferences were having. The Big 12 seems to have avoided it. And I would not be shocked if in some medium-term future, the Big 10 and the SEC are the giants, but the Big 12 is the third wheel in some ways, a little bit smaller than those two. And I say that knowing the Pac-12 hired George Kliavkoff, who was also an outsider, and it did not go nearly as well for them. But I think in college sports, there's a lot of folks who are now realizing that maybe finding executives that are outside of the traditional paradigm or traditional structure of the sport is the future. Again, you and I have talked about this before also. We're entering this age in sports team ownership where everyone's a super owner. Almost everyone who buys a major team now is someone that owns a major team in some other league. Josh Harris and David Blitzer being a perfect example of that. And because of that experience, I think that those guys are more likely to understand that, the person that works on the NBA side is just as qualified to help me pick a head coach in football as maybe someone who's been in the NFL for 25 years, because the things that I want him looking for, I want her looking for, is not necessarily NFL specific. I think the more that we have owners that are sitting across multiple leagues, the more obvious it is to some of them that skill sets are transportable and you don't need an NFL lifer to come in and make an NFL decision.
Eben Novy-Williams from Sportico is with us, of course, covering the business of sports. Huge story that we'll get to in just a moment today. Totally overshadowed, obviously, by this Adam Peters news, but 10% of Monumental Sports has been sold. The second biggest shareholder, or I shouldn't say has been sold, but is going to be sold. We'll get to that in just a minute. But the last thing I want to ask you kind of on the Josh Harris front, Eben, and this is on some level about Josh, but also you just sparked this thought on like kind of sports ownership as a whole and the shifting nature of who's buying teams. Like if you hear Josh speak, and I was at the press conference on Monday, and this is a guy who's clearly got thoughts that are together and cohesive, and you're like, oh, this is different, especially compared to the last guy, but also different than like, Jerry Jones has obviously won Super Bowls back in the 90s, and look, they've had three straight 12-win seasons. The Cowboys have built the behemoth. But like kind of that old school, like he's been around a while and may have bought the team for a number that would not get you much more than a sliver of a percentage today. Or you have the families that have been around and grown up in it versus someone like Harris who like made his money in business. Josh Harris grew up middle class at best in DC, from what I understand. And, it wasn't like he grew up poor, but he definitely wasn't, in the suites at RFK. I don't even know if RFK had suites. Point is, like, he was kind of a regular dude who worked really hard and lived and did well in the finance world and made billions of dollars. And the strategy and the types of things that are involved in doing that, I think, come out when you hear him speak about his teams. Have you noticed that, like, how unique is Harris in that, and like how has that profile of owner changed, let's say, over the last decade?
Yeah, I think that's interesting. Josh is obviously very much not a regular person anymore in any capacity, but he is definitely the newer age type of money. And the easiest comparison there, I think you're right, Craig, is looking at the NBA versus the NFL. One of the reasons I think a lot of people think of the NBA as being a bit more progressive and a bit more cutting edge from a tech and experimental standpoint than the NFL is because when Adam Silver sits across the room at owners meetings and looks across at the 30 men and women in that room, a lot of them are Josh Harris type folks. They're people who are not in their 70s or 80s. They're in their 50s or 60s, and they made their money more recently. And maybe they made their money in a tech directive way or in a new media way. There's a lot of newish billionaires in the NBA. And a lot of them, I think, talk in the way that you're talking about, that when Matt Ishbia, who just bought the Suns for $4 billion, when Ryan Smith, who bought the Utah Jazz a few years before that, when they talk about their teams, it sounds very different than when these legacy, and Jerry Jones hasn't owned the Cowboys for even that long, but these folks that have owned NFL teams for 30 years or 100 years in their family, as some have, right. It's a very different structure for sure.
Yeah, I think it's the best way to put it. Feel free to use this term now because you would have way more opportunities to use it than me. A first generation rich person.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. And the NFL is a business built on the back of third generation rich people largely, right? There are more teams, NFL teams, that have their same ownership group from the 40s and 50s that have sold in the past decade. Way more. So yeah, it's a very different structure. And look, if I would bet that if you put Roger Goodell in a lie detector test, that he loves the idea of more people like Greg Penner and the Waltons, or more people like Josh Harris and David Blitzer coming in. I think it freshens things up. I think it keeps the NFL on its toes a little bit. And yeah, I think it will probably lead to more innovative things happening the more of those people come into ownership discussions.
Yeah, and I think obviously our audience cares a lot more about the on the field thing. And as someone who watched like the Mavericks in a weird place, like when I was working in Dallas, it was just after they had won their title, and the rest of the NBA by that point, it kind of caught up to a lot of the things that helped the Mavericks have a decade of success before then. Like obviously the biggest factor is they had a 7-foot tall German who could shoot threes, and he was really good.
Generational talent.
Yeah, generational talent tends to help, but they were on the cutting edge of analytics, and like they would rob teams in trades because other teams had general managers that were old school and just straight up old that would be like, I don't know, we don't need that guy. And the Mavs were like, secretly, we have data that suggests he's very valuable. And I think that is an interesting thing for me to watch with the Commanders on the field in the next couple of years is, are there areas still with where we are now in kind of the data, analytics, sports science, individual and collective revolutions that they can still be ahead under a guy like Harris, who's an innovative thinker, or has there enough has there been enough work done and there are enough smart people in front offices that there actually isn't that much of an advantage to be had? And by the way, the Commanders are going to have to play catch up in a lot of those areas anyway, because right now they're behind.
It's interesting to hear your recollections in Dallas, because Mark Cuban was maybe the first of this class of owner, right,
100%.
to get into the
kind of
NBA.
what make me think of it.
Yeah, exactly. And I remember once at Sloan, the MIT conference, probably in 2013, Mark Cuban on stage saying that the only people he likes to lock for bigger deals than his players are his medical staff. And he talked at length about the nutrition, sleep science, all of that kind of analytics that they were doing. And at that point, very few NBA teams were doing anything close to what the Mavericks were doing. So yeah, I would bet that there are, and it may take years to figure out, but I bet you there are some things that Josh's group, given its experience and its virtually unlimited funds of money, there are probably some things that they're going to do in Washington with the Commanders that are cutting edge for modern day NFL. And yes, I believe that will probably help the team in the long run.
And Adam Peters gets to be in charge of it, which is pretty sweet.
Exactly,
all right.
Exactly.
The thing that I thought was going to be the big breaking news story of the day is something that Eben broke just before noon today. Eben Novy-Williams from Sportico is with us. So tell us what's happening here. And I really, honestly, like the what is pretty basic as of now. You have the second largest stakeholder, Steve Jobs' widow, who's also very impressive in her own right, selling her stake in Monumental, and also why. So kind of what's the deal here?
Yeah, so Loren Pal Jobs, who in 2017, I believe, bought about 20% of Monumental. She is, as you said, the largest shareholder in the company outside of Ted Leonsis. She's in the market right now. She's selling at least 10% from what I understand. So at least around half, maybe even more of her equity. Notable for a few reasons, Craig. It was huge news when she bought in. There's not that many women owners in sports, particularly ones that bought by themselves as opposed to being part of a bigger family thing. So she was notable in that, right? Obviously the largest shareholder in a huge sports company is notable as well. You asked the obvious right question, and I wish I had answers, but the why, it's unclear to me exactly why. There's a million possibilities, but it comes at such an interesting time for Monumental, between the sovereign wealth investment last year, what Ted has proposed in terms of an arena in Northern Virginia and how feasible and how the funding of that's going to work. It is interesting for a number of reasons. And I agree with you. It brings up a lot more questions than, unfortunately, I have answers right now. But 10% of Monumental is it's not a small piece of a piece of sports, right? This could sell for $400 million. It could sell for considerably more than that. So yeah, it's fascinating when these things come up for sale, and it will be very interesting to see who is the interested buyers when they get to that point.
For sure. And so the financial piece of that, I think, is very interesting in terms of you quote in your story the valuation that they used to sell the 5% to the Qatari investment fund. You also had another number in there that I'm now totally blanking on because my brain is spinning with a million things today. But like with this stadium coming soon. Oh, you had the value of the Caps and the Wizards. And then obviously there's other pieces of Monumental as well. But with this new stadium thing floating out there, like how does that impact how you guys at Sportico, and I guess more importantly, all due respect to you guys, how the actual buyers will value Monumental Sports? And
yeah, I think 10%. It's a big question. And once we have specifics, if that is that a go, I know it's a public-private partnership, but who's footing the bulk of the money and who's paying what and who gets to share in or operate what? There's a lot of details in there, but no question, if and when the Capitals and Wizards are playing in a new building, and if the economics are good for them, not just on construction, but on operation, it's going to make both those teams more valuable. And Ted is very big on the idea of putting his sports teams at the center of a broader business and leveraging the popularity and strength of those businesses to build other things. Real estate is one of the main ways that sports team owners do that. So I would imagine that once the firm plan is set, I would think that those teams would be a bit more valuable because of having it. But the obvious question again is how much is it going to cost? And Who knows? There's often capital calls on LPs when teams need money. And I have no inside information about whether Laurene Powell Jobs is worried about that or doesn't want to participate in that, whatever. But it's going to cost money to get to there, right? And that's money that's going to have to be spent by Monumental, probably have to be spent by its LPs as well. So yeah, in the short term, probably money coming out. But in the long term, the way that Sportico values teams and the way that modern sports economics work from a franchise standpoint, being in an arena that's not 20 or 25 years old, whatever Capital One is right now, and having a better control over the levers of that is going to end up being almost certainly a better situation for them, just like with the Commanders, right? This is what Josh wants, and it's going to be way more expensive for Josh and the Commanders to make that happen from a venue standpoint. But this is the dream, is to be in your own place, to have mixed use development, to be able to control who's in and who's out, sharing all the economics of a brand new glitzy stadium. And I think in 5 years, both of the Commanders and the Wizards and Capitals are going to be on their way to having something.
Yeah, I mean, it's so fascinating too, because there's also with the Qataris buying in, or like, do you oppose for whatever reason the just like you disagree with the decision to go to Alexandria, or is it just plain money? Typically, it's just plain money where you don't want to put it in. But there's so many questions that I have, and who knows if we'll get the answers. But I'm gonna guess, Eben Novy-Williams, that you're gonna keep digging.
We'll search. Yeah. One last thing on that, Craig, you mentioned the Qataris there. One of the things that popped up when they made that investment, the QIA, which is the Qatari Sovereign Wealth Fund, owns a big development in Chinatown in DC, like across the street from where the Wizards and Capitals play. And one of the things that kept coming up in my conversations around that deal was that there was a very big real estate synergy between the holdings of Monumental and the holdings of QIA in DC. Now that if the team moves to Northern Virginia, right, suddenly that synergy in some ways at least dissipates a little bit. But I did think it was interesting that part of what I kept hearing about that deal was that there was right next door to the arena what was a large piece of development that QIA was working on. So again, we'll see what happens if the team actually does move and where they move to. But there was at least a downtown DC or a Chinatown DC tie that could be lost if the team does move.
Ooh, that's pretty fascinating. All right. Eben Novy-Williams, you want more on the sale or potential sale of 10% of Monumental and all the details, the facts and figures, go read his stuff at Sportico, and always appreciate his perspective as someone who has been following what Josh Harris is doing for a long time. Eben, appreciate you, sir. Have a great weekend.
Thank you, Craig.
Hey, this is DA, and you're listening to The Hoffman Show on the Team 980 and the Odyssey app.